The long road home, the rain came sideways, not the gentle kind that softens the desert and makes the sage smell sweet. This was the other kind, the kind that Highway 40 reserves for its worst nights when the sky turns the color of a bruise and the wind comes down from the plateaus with the specific anger of something that has been building all day and has finally decided to stop restraining itself. The kind of rain that does not ask permission and does not offer apology. The kind that finds every crack in every wall and reminds you that nothing out here was built to last forever. The highway was empty in both directions as far as the eye could follow, which was not far. Headlights dissolved into gray curtains of water 30 yards out and disappeared completely. The painted lines on the asphalt had turned silver. The road signs shook in their moorings. Out past the gravel shoulder, the desert was invisible, swallowed whole by the dark and the weather. A man was on his knees in the mud. He was large, even kneeling. Broad shoulders straining the seams of a leather jacket that had seen better decades. Gray-bearded, strong-jawed hands the size of small shovels on pressed flat and hard against another person's chest. The body beneath him was not moving. There was blood, a great deal of it, black in the rain, spreading through the gravel like ink through water. The man's jaw was set tight. His eyes were open, but not seeing the rain or the highway or the dark. Seeing only the 2 square inches of pressure he was maintaining with everything he had left in his arms. Behind him, 3 motorcycles stood at odd angles, with their engines still running headlights, cutting pale cones through the downpour. One had been laid down hard, its chrome scraping a long silver scar across the asphalt. The exhaust pipes steamed where the rain hit them. A police radio crackled somewhere in the dark. The man on his knees did not look up. His lips were moving, not praying exactly, more like a negotiation. The private, furious kind that men make with God or fate or whatever they have decided is listening when the situation has moved past the point of rational hope. The kind of negotiation that sounds like orders because the man making it has spent his life in places where orders were the only language that worked. A second man appeared from the darkness, running, limping, one hand pressed to his own ribs. He dropped to one knee in the gravel, and his voice, when it came, carried the worn trace of an Irish accent that 30 years of American roads had smoothed but never fully erased. How bad? The first man's jaw tightened. He did not answer right away. The rain hammered his back, soaked through to the skin, ran down his neck and into his collar. He was beyond caring about the cold. Bad enough, he said. His voice was gravel and old roads and something else underneath, something that had been compressed down into a very small and very controlled space over a very long time. Something that had spent 40 years being managed and was on this particular night beginning to refuse management. He pressed harder. The lights of an ambulance appeared in the distance, blinking red and white through the curtain of rain. Still far away, but coming. "Hold on," the first man said, and it was not clear whether he was speaking to the person beneath his hands or to himself or to something older and more complicated than either. "You don't get to go anywhere. Not tonight." The rain kept coming. The lights kept blinking. On Highway 40 in the mud and the blood in the dark, a man who had spent 40 years not knowing his own name refused to let go. The screen went black. 3 words appeared white against black, simple as a gravestone. 14 hours earlier. The alarm clock on Dorothy Harlan's nightstand went off at 4:45 in the morning, the same as it had every day for the past 42 years. It was a wind-up clock, the old kind, with 2 small bells on top and a hammer between them that struck back and forth with a sound like a tiny, determined argument. She had bought it at a hardware store in Flagstaff in 1979 after the power went out during a monsoon, and she missed the breakfast rush and lost money she could not afford to lose. After that, she trusted nothing that required electricity to do a job that springs and gears could do just as well. She was already half awake when it went off. She always was. Sleep at 78 had become a negotiation rather than a surrender. 4 hours here, 2 hours there. She lay in the dark in between and thought about things she had spent 40 years thinking about, the same thoughts in the same grooves, the way water carves stone, given enough time and enough repetition. She silenced the clock without looking at it. For a moment, she lay still and listened to the desert at 4 in the morning. Out here 40 miles east of Flagstaff on the old alignment of Route 66, the silence before dawn was absolute in a way that city people never quite believed when she described it. No traffic, no voices, just wind, occasional coyotes somewhere in the dark hills, and the particular depth of quiet that comes from being a serious distance from other human beings. She did not mind it. She had grown used to it the way you grow used to most things you cannot change, not with peace, exactly, not with resignation, but with a stubborn accommodation, the way an old tree grows around a fence post, making the obstacle part of itself rather than fighting it forever. She sat up, put her feet on the floor. The linoleum was cold even through her socks. Her knees offered their morning opinion, and she ignored them the same way she had been ignoring them for 15 years with the determination of a woman who had decided long ago that she would not be stopped by anything as ordinary as pain. The bedroom was small and full of the careful accumulation of a long life. A quilt her mother had made faded now to soft colors. A wooden dresser with a cracked mirror that she had kept rather than replacing because Roy had put a small mark on the frame the first Christmas they were married, a tiny cross in pencil, and she had never been able to bring herself to move it out of the room where he had made it. Photographs on the wall. Her wedding photo. Roy in his sheriff's uniform, not quite 25, looking at the camera with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world was something that could be set right if a person worked hard enough and stayed honest. She could not look at that photograph without feeling the full weight of everything that had come after it, so she had learned over decades to glance at it rather than look, to let her eyes pass over it the way you pass over a scar you have had so long it has become part of your face. There was another photograph, smaller, in a frame she had bought at a five-and-dime store and repainted herself when the finish started peeling. A boy, 18 years old, standing in front of a motorcycle. A 1984 Harley-Davidson Sportster cherry red chrome, catching the afternoon light of a June day that felt, looking back at it from the far side of 40 years, like it had happened in some other person's life entirely. The boy was smiling at whoever held the camera. His jaw was strong and his eyes were bright, and he had the brightness that some young men carry right before experience begins its long work on them. She looked at that photograph every morning, had done so for 40 years. She said the same thing she always said quietly, the way you speak to someone in the next room when you are not certain they can hear you, but you say it anyway because the saying matters. Morning, Nathan. Then she put on her house coat and went to start the coffee. Cross Junction Diner sat at the intersection of Highway 40 and a county road that led north into the high desert and eventually to nowhere in particular. Roy Harlan had built it in 1969 with money borrowed from his father-in-law and wood purchased from a salvage yard in Winslow. It was not a beautiful building. Roy had been a better sheriff than a carpenter, and the original structure showed this in its slightly uneven roofline and the front door that had always swung a few degrees past true level. Over the decades, Dorothy had repaired and added to it and painted it so many times that the original boards were buried under 40 years of decisions, and the building had become, in its accumulation of repairs and the simple fact of still standing when so much around it had fallen, something that looked less like a diner and more like a declaration. Open, 5 in the morning, closed 9 at night, every day except Christmas and the anniversary of Roy's death, when Dorothy closed at noon and spent the afternoon at the cemetery in Flagstaff, and then came back and sat on the porch and watched the highway until the light failed. By 5:15, the coffee was made, the grill was hot, and the first regulars were already pulling off the highway. Truckers mostly. Two ranchers who came in every Tuesday and Thursday and sat at the same table and talked about water rights and feed prices in the unhurried way of men who have been friends since boyhood and have long since stopped needing to perform for each other. A highway patrol officer named Grady, who drove the overnight shift on this stretch of 40 and always came in for breakfast before heading home. Willa arrived at 5:30 as she did every morning, 23 years old, from a town in Oklahoma that she was in the process of putting in as much distance between herself and as the American Southwest would allow. She had shown up 9 months ago with a duffel bag in a direct manner and asked Dorothy if she was hiring. Dorothy had not been hiring. She had looked at the girl for 10 seconds and told her to come back tomorrow with an apron. Willa was fast and did not complain and had a memory for orders that Dorothy found genuinely impressive in someone so young. She also asked questions which Dorothy found either endearing or exhausting, depending on the morning. You sleep, Willa asked, tying her apron as she came through the kitchen door. Enough. You say that every day, because it's true every day. Willa poured herself a coffee and leaned against the counter. She looked at the dining room at the tables Dorothy had already wiped at the specials board in Dorothy's careful old-fashioned hand. Apple pie again today? Apple pie every day. You made 3 of them last night, I counted. Dorothy did not look up from the grill. Mind the counter. Willa minded the counter. But she watched Dorothy move the way young people sometimes watch older ones when they are trying to understand something about time and what it does to a person, and she noticed as she sometimes did the quality of stillness that Dorothy carried. Not the stillness of someone who has given up, more like the stillness of someone waiting. focused and undefeated, with a direction to it. On the wall above the pie case, the photograph of Nathan Harlan at 18 looked out over the dining room with his young man's smile. Below it, on a small shelf Dorothy had put there herself, and that no one in 40 years had suggested should be removed, sat the motorcycle trophy Nathan had won at a county fair at 16 in a small piece of paper in a plastic sleeve. In Nathan's handwriting, "I'll be back for dinner. Don't wait up." He had left it as a joke, the kind of thing a teenager writes when he is going to a friend's house for the night and wants to be dramatic about it. He had not known when he wrote it that the words would become something else entirely over the years. Something Dorothy read every morning before the doors opened the way she read the photograph. Don't wait up. She had been waiting for 40 years. She did not intend to stop. By 9, the morning rush had settled into the long quiet of a weekday in October. 2 tables occupied, the truckers gone. Grady gone to London, the ranchers working through their second cups with the unhurried patience of men who have nowhere pressing to be. Dorothy moved through her work with the efficiency of someone who has performed the same motions so many times they have become a form of meditation. Hands knowing where everything was before her mind directed them. Body carrying the accumulated knowledge of 42 years of making food for strangers on a highway in the desert. She was rolling pie crust when she noticed her hands. She had added cinnamon to the apple filling, more than the recipe called for. Twice the amount the way she used to make it when Nathan was small, because he had been particular about cinnamon in the way that children have strong opinions about things that seem unimportant to everyone else. She had not thought about it. Her hands had simply done it the way they sometimes did, reaching back past 40 years to the knowledge of what her son had loved before the world took him from her. She stood still for a moment looking at the bowl. Then she finished the crust, crimped the edges, put the pie in the oven. Some habits do not go away. Some things the body holds past the reach of time. By 4 in the afternoon, the sky had changed. Weather in the Arizona desert has its own vocabulary, and Dorothy had been reading it for decades. The color before a serious storm was different from the color before ordinary rain. Deeper bruising at the western edge. A more deliberate darkness coming over the high ground to the north. The wind shifted and sent grit from the shoulder skating across the parking lot in small spiraling columns, the desert's way of clearing its throat before it spoke in earnest. Willa looked out the window. "Big ones stay open late," Dorothy said. "Travelers will need somewhere dry." She went and turned on the neon sign in the window. Open, red and gold, and flickering at the O the way it had flickered for 20 years, a small electrical fault that 3 different repairmen had failed to fix, and that Dorothy had eventually decided to leave because she had grown used to its rhythm, like a heartbeat, like something alive and stubborn that refused to be corrected. She went back to the counter and refilled her own coffee and looked out at the highway and the coming storm, and she did what she had done every evening of every year for 40 years. She waited. They heard the motorcycles before they saw them. That was the thing about Harleys in open country. In the held-breath quiet before a storm, when the wind had temporarily died, the sound of a large displacement V-twin engine carried across distances that seemed impossible. Dorothy heard them first as a low reverberation in the base of her chest, more than a sound in her ears, like the first touch of bass from a sound system 2 rooms away. She looked up from the counter. Willa was already at the window. "How many?" Dorothy asked. 8, Willa said. She had lived long enough in rural Oklahoma and now rural Arizona to have formed opinions about motorcycles and the people who rode them, and Dorothy could hear those opinions in the single syllable. Dorothy set the coffee pot on the warmer and squared her shoulders in the way she had learned over 42 years of running a roadside diner alone. Not bracing for something bad, deciding in advance that whatever came through the door, she had already survived worse. She had. The Harleys rolled into the parking lot in a loose formation that spoke of long familiarity without requiring choreography. Heritage Classics Road. King's One Fat Boy. All of them heavy, all of them carrying the road-worn dignity of machines that had covered serious miles under serious circumstances. Their headlights swept the front of the diner as they turned, sending moving shadows across the dining room walls. They parked with the practiced ease of people who have parked motorcycles in 10,000 parking lots and do not need to think about it. Engines cut one after another in a falling sequence. Rain was already beginning to spot the asphalt individual drops hitting the hot metal of the pipes with brief hissing sounds. The first man through the door was the kind that changed the feeling of a room without trying. 6'2", 220 pounds, and built not from deliberate training, but from a life that had made physical demands on a regular basis and been met. 58 years old. Leather jacket with the Desert Reapers, MC patch on the back. Phoenix chapter, and above that, the rocker that told her what she already knew from the way he moved. President. His beard was gray, close-cropped. His face had been left out in the weather for several decades and had become through that process something harder and more enduring than ordinary faces. His eyes, when they caught the light, were the color of storm clouds. Pale gray, with something moving behind them the way lightning moves inside a cloud before it commits to striking. He came through the door and stopped 2 steps inside it and did what he always did in unfamiliar spaces, a habit so ingrained it had long since passed beyond decision into reflex. Eyes to the corners first, then the exits, then the other people in the room, then the layout, and finally briefly to the person behind the counter. Their eyes met. Dorothy held the coffee pot and looked at him and felt something she had no name for and had not felt before. A recognition without an object, a familiarity without a source. The sensation of knowing a face that you cannot place, of hearing music you are certain you have never heard, and yet somehow know from the inside. It lasted less than a second. She ended it first because she was 78 years old and had spent 40 years not allowing herself to misread things that might hurt her, and she had become very practiced at the discipline of not reaching for what was not there. Counter or booth, she said. Her voice was steady, her hands were steady. That had always been her particular discipline. Whatever she felt, her hands did not show it. Roy had loved that about her. Had said once the year before he died that her hands were the most honest and most dishonest things about her because they never trembled when she was afraid, and they kept working long after any reasonable person would have put them down. The man looked at the room. Something passed between him and the older man behind him, compact, watchful, with white-streaked beard and the faint trace of Irish in his face, a communication that required no words and lasted about as long as a drawn breath. Booths, he said. His voice was gravel and old roads. Back ones, if that's all right. He paused. Something moved briefly across his face. We'll be quiet. Just need coffee and something hot. The older man at his shoulder stepped forward. His eyes had been cataloging the room since he walked in, filing conclusions with the speed of someone who had spent a long time in situations where slow conclusions had consequences. But when he spoke, there was something in his voice that did not match the watchfulness in his eyes. A thread of something almost warm. And pie, if you have it. Our president here has been riding through November weather in the Sonoran Desert for 6 hours, and he has the temperament of a man who needs pie. He delivered this with the timing of someone who has learned over many years of close friendship exactly how to be funny about a person in a way that is also quietly protective. Dorothy looked at him, then at the man he had called president. The president was looking at the back of the diner with the focused inward look of someone searching a room for a memory that may or may not exist. Apple pie, Dorothy said. Made it fresh this morning. She did not know why she said it that way. She usually just said yes. They filled the 2 back booths. 8 men, all of them carrying the same quality. The quality of people who had been places and done things and come out the other side not unmarked but unbroken. Different ages, different histories written into the lines of their faces, but all sharing something you could not name specifically and yet could feel. A quality of being fully awake to the room in a way that most people in ordinary circumstances were not. The president and the Irishman took the booth nearest the door. The president sat with his back to the wall. Dorothy noticed this. She noticed everything about how people settled into her diner, the way a person develops a fluency in human behavior after 4 decades of watching travelers pass through. His back to the wall. Eyes on the entrance, the 2 windows flanking it, the emergency exit by the kitchen. One hand on the table open. The other in his lap, not entirely still. She brought the coffee. 8 cups on a tray, set down one by one with the ease of long practice. When she placed the first cup in front of the president, he looked up. His eyes up close were lighter than she had thought, almost silver in the fluorescent light. Thank you, ma'am, he said. He wrapped both hands around the cup, large hands, scarred knuckles, a tattoo visible below the cuff of his jacket on his right forearm, something she could not quite read from where she stood, and looked down at the coffee with the private expression of a man settling into something after a long time of being unable to settle. She did not move immediately. This was unusual for her. She was not someone who lingered. You boys been riding long. Phoenix to Flagstaff. He was still looking at the coffee, had to take it slow in this weather. He raised the cup and drank, closed his eyes for just a moment, a brief involuntary expression of something simple and right. Good coffee, been making it 42 years. You learn a thing or two. He opened his eyes and looked at her. really looked with the same quality of attention he had given the room when he came in. 42 years, he said, in the same place. This place, yes. That's a long time to stay anywhere. It's home, she said, or as close to one as I have anymore. Something shifted in his expression, brief and small like a light changing in a room upstairs. Before he could respond, the Irishman cleared his throat from across the table and said pleasantly and with purpose, "The pie love when you get a chance. We're patient men." She went to get the pie. In the kitchen, she stood with her hands on the counter and let herself breathe for a moment. Her heart was doing something she did not want to examine too closely. She was 78 years old and had learned long ago, and at great cost, the price of reaching for things that turned out not to be there. She had learned it multiple times in multiple ways, and she was not, she told herself firmly, going to be foolish about a stranger's eyes in the way he had said 42 years as though the number meant something to him he could not account for. She began cutting the pie. 8 slices. She added extra cinnamon to each plate, a small addition, a garnish of instinct, the way she sometimes did when her hands were working ahead of her mind. She did not realize she had done it until all 8 plates were on the tray. She looked at the plates, at the cinnamon. She picked up the tray and carried it out. She set the first plate in front of him. He looked at it. His expression was neutral, and then it was not. "How'd you know?" he said. She looked at him. "Know what?" "The cinnamon." He was looking at the plate. His voice had tightened closed slightly around something unexpected. "How'd you know I like extra cinnamon?" Dorothy stood very still. "Lucky guess," she said. The words came out steady. She was very good at steady. She had been practicing it for 40 years. He looked up at her and she looked at him, and between them there was a silence of the kind that does not mean nothing. The silence of 2 people standing on opposite sides of a door that neither of them is quite ready to open. The Irishman from his seat across the table was looking at neither of them. He was looking at his coffee cup, stirring it slowly with a spoon, with the close concentration of a man paying very careful attention to everything in the room while appearing to pay attention to nothing. The president looked back down at the plate. He picked up the fork, cut a piece, brought it to his mouth, and stopped. The fork held in his hand suspended. His eyes had gone somewhere else. Not closed, not unfocused, but oriented inward rather than outward, aimed at something that was not in the room, something a long way down. "You all right?" the Irishman asked, quietly. "The way you ask someone you know well." The president did not answer immediately. The rain had picked up outside, hitting the windows in earnest now. The old building moved slightly in the wind, the way it always had in serious weather, a small, perceptible settling into itself. Boards against boards, the sound of something that has stood long enough to know how to stand. "Yeah," he said finally. He set the fork down. "It just reminded me of something." "Of what?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I can't." He stopped, shook his head very slightly, the small motion of a man trying to locate something that has retreated from his reach. It's like the feeling of remembering without the memory itself, like the shape of something without the thing. Dorothy walked back to the counter. She set the tray down. She picked up a dish towel and began folding it, which was not something that needed to be done. Her hands needed an occupation. Willa appeared at her elbow. "You okay, Dot?" "Fine." Willa looked at her for a moment and then looked toward the back of the room at the man in the booth who was now staring at his coffee with the expression of someone trying to read a message in a language they once knew. "Who are they?" "Travelers," Dorothy said, "who need coffee and pie." Willa let it go. She refilled the rancher's cups and cleared the corner table and left Dorothy standing at the counter with a folded dish towel and a heart doing something she had told herself she would not allow. The rain had become serious. The neon sign beat its red and gold rhythm against the windows. The parking lot was a mirror of standing water. On the highway, a semi went past with its lights blazing trailing spray that dissolved into the dark. Out in the desert, the storm had removed all distances, collapsing the landscape to the tight circle of what the diner's lights could reach and nothing beyond. The dining room was warm and smelled of coffee and apple pie and the combination of road dust and leather and engine grease that 8 men who have been riding in weather bring through a door. Dorothy moved between the tables, refilling cups. This was her practice, her particular form of movement through the world, the repetitive, useful motion that let the body work while the mind attended to other things. She was pouring the president's 4th cup when the bell above the door sounded. The sound it made was the same sound it always made. Same bell, same tone, the sound it had produced 10,000 times in 42 years. But something about what followed the sound, some quality of the stillness that came after it made the hair on her arms rise before she looked up. The door opened. 5 men came in. They were not like the bikers. That was the first thing you understood, and the thing that took longer to explain. The bikers wore their edges openly, the leather, the patches, the road wear, the general advertisement that they were not people to treat without care. There was an honesty to that. You knew what you were looking at. These men wore suits, expensive ones, cut with precision for specific bodies. They moved with the smooth certainty of men who had been told repeatedly and over a long time that every room they entered was their room, that the ordinary social negotiations of public space did not fully apply to them. The man at the front was 54 years old. Silver hair swept back from a face that had been handsome once and was now something more polished and less honest than handsome. A wedding ring, a watch that communicated things to people who knew how to read such things. His eyes, when they moved across the room, did not pause on the bikers in the back with wariness. They paused the way you pause over something you have cataloged and assessed and do not consider a serious variable. His name was Warren Vance. Dorothy knew the name. She had seen it on billboards, in the Flagstaff paper. Vance Mineral Group, copper extraction, rare earth metals. A man whose family had built their fortune in the ground beneath this desert and who had spent his adult life pulling that fortune out of it. Mrs. Harlan, his voice was smooth and warm and calibrated the voice of a man who had been to school on the subject of his own voice and had done the necessary work. Beautiful night, isn't it? It's pouring rain, Mr. Vance. He smiled. Matter of perspective. One of his men placed a folder on the counter with the rehearsed motion of someone who had performed this specific action before. My company has been conducting surveys in this area. He glanced toward the back of the room toward the bikers, and his smile held the particular quality of a man noting a detail that confirmed something he already knew. Interesting clientele tonight. In the back booth, the president had not moved, had not changed his posture or altered his expression, but his eyes had come to Vance and had not left him, and they held the patient watchfulness of a man deciding whether a situation requires him to stand up. Vance turned back to Dorothy. Turns out the land your diner sits on has significant mineral deposits. Copper, possibly more. He put his hand on the folder. I'm prepared to offer you $4.2 million cash. You can retire. Leave the highway. You've been doing this alone for a long time, Mrs. Harlan. You've earned the rest. Dorothy looked at the folder. She did not touch it. Not interested, she said. Mrs. Harlan, my husband built this place with his own hands, she said. Her voice did not rise. It became quieter the way strong things become quieter when they are most serious. He built it and he died before he got to see what it became. My son grew up here. This is the last place I have of both of them. There isn't a number. Something moved across Vance's face. It passed quickly, replaced by the practiced pleasantness. But it had been there. Not quite anger. The recalibration of a man who has encountered an obstacle he thought he had already accounted for. He reached into his breast pocket and placed a card on the counter with the deliberate precision of a man making a final move. 48 hours, Mrs. Harlan. After that, the offer changes. He paused. The warmth in his voice had not left it, but something underneath the warmth had become visible, the way bedrock becomes visible when the water drops. I'd encourage you not to let this become complicated. Opportunities like this have a way of becoming unavoidable, one way or another. He was not threatening her. Not quite. There was enough deniability in every word for it to be read as friendly advice. That was the craft of it. Dorothy had been alive long enough to hear the distance between what was said and what was meant, and she heard it now with clarity. She looked at him and said nothing. Vance collected his men with a glance and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on it and looked back once, and then briefly he looked past Dorothy toward the back of the room, toward the president. And in that look, Dorothy saw something that she did not yet have the context to understand. Not recognition exactly, more like confirmation. Like a man finding something he had been told to expect and finding it where he was told it would be. Then he was gone. The rain absorbed the sound of his departure. Dorothy stood at the counter. The business card lay face up and she did not pick it up. Ma'am, she looked up. The president was standing at the near end of the counter. He had crossed the room without sound, without drawing the attention of anyone in it, with the physical economy of someone whose movements had been trained for environments where efficiency was the difference between one outcome and another. He stood a respectful distance from her. His hands were visible and open at his sides. You know that man, he said, by reputation. What kind? The kind, she said, that gets what he wants, one way or another. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes went to the door, then back to her. Both of them, he said. She looked at him. Your husband and your son, he said. You lost them both the same year. The air in the room shifted slightly. She had not said this. She had not said anything about Roy. She had only said that the diner was the last place she had of both of them. He had heard something in that she had not consciously put there or had put there without intending to be heard. She looked at him for a long moment. Roy was killed in the fall of 1984, she said. He was the county sheriff. He found something he was not supposed to find, and the people who did not want it found made sure he stopped looking. 6 weeks later, Nathan was gone. Cole said nothing. His face had not changed in the way of someone receiving unexpected information. It had changed in the way of someone receiving information that confirms something they have been, without knowing it, bracing to hear. How long have you been running this place alone, he said. Since the day Roy died, she said. 40 years. He looked at her. The exhaustion that had been in his face when he walked through the door was gone entirely now. What was there instead was focus. The eyes of a man who has recognized danger and is orienting himself toward it. No family nearby. She felt the weight of the question, not because it was intrusive, because it was the question that had no clean answer, the one she had been unable to answer honestly for 40 years. No, she said. No family nearby. It was the truth. It was also not the whole truth. Somewhere out there she had held this knowledge for 40 years with the certainty of gravity, with the bone-deep knowledge that a mother carries in the same place she once carried her child Nathan was alive. She did not know where. She did not know who he had become. But she had never for a single day believed the official account, the tidy bureaucratic closure of a file that had declared her son dead without ever producing a body, on the word of people whose interest in the matter she had understood too late. The president was watching her face. He was quiet in a way that had its own quality, the kind of quiet that does not need to be filled, that is itself a form of paying attention. We'll stay tonight, he said, just to make sure things stay quiet. You don't have to do that. No, ma'am, but we're going to. I can't pay you. Didn't ask. She opened her mouth and closed it again. He was looking at her steadily, not with the condescension of someone deciding what was good for her, with the simpler and more fundamental quality of a man who has decided that this is the correct thing to do and is not particularly interested in being argued out of it. There's a garage out back, she said finally. Old. Hasn't been used much, but it's dry, big enough for the bikes. That'll do. He turned and walked back toward the booths, moving easily through the room, and he spoke to his men in a low voice, and 4 of them rose and went out into the rain to move the motorcycles. The other 4 arranged themselves with the same unhurried naturalness, one with a sight line to the front door, one to the east windows, one near the kitchen entrance, one where he could see both. Done without discussion, without instruction. The way people position themselves in a space when the training has become something older than habit. The Irishman came to the counter. He stood beside one of the stools and looked at Dorothy with those sharp eyes that had been cataloging everything since he walked in, and his expression held something that had not been fully visible before. A thread of something that was not quite wonder, but was close to it. 15 years you ran this place alone, he said. 40 years, she said. He absorbed this without changing his expression. Then he looked toward the back of the room, toward the president, who had returned to the booth and sat with his back to the wall and his face toward the door and his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he was not drinking. I've ridden with that man for 15 years, Seamus said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man choosing his words because he means them to be precise. Ridden with him through things I would not describe in polite company. And in all that time he stopped. His eyes came back to Dorothy. I have never once seen him look at anything the way he looked at you when he came through that door. Dorothy held his gaze. Steady. He's tired, she said. 6 hours in the rain. He is, Seamus agreed. He picked up his coffee cup. But that's not what it was. He went back to his booth. Dorothy stood at the counter. The clock on the wall ticked through the storm. The one that ran 5 minutes slow, because Nathan had said it that way when he was 12 years old. 5 minutes slow means you're never late, he had told her, with the satisfied logic of a child who has solved a problem in a way that pleases him. And Dorothy had never changed it back, and had never changed it back, and had never changed it back. She refilled the coffee. She waited. The garage was behind the diner, separated from it by 30 feet of cracked concrete that the rain had turned into a shallow river. The president found the door unlocked the way Dorothy had said it would be, and pushed it open and stood for a moment while his eyes adjusted to the dark inside. It was not large, big enough for 6 bikes if they were careful, with a workbench along one wall and pegboard above it where tools hung in their outlines the silhouettes of a working life. The floor was clean, cleaner than you would expect of a garage that had not been actively used in years. Someone came in here and swept it. Someone kept it in a state of readiness. Not because it was being used, but because keeping it ready was a form of something. Faith, maybe. The refusal to accept that readiness was no longer required. In the far corner under a canvas cover was a motorcycle. The president stood in the entrance and looked at it without approaching. The shape of it, the specific profile of the covered machine, produced in his chest the sensation he knew best from his dreams. The sensation of reaching for something in the dark that his hand understood before the rest of him did. Boone came up beside him. Broad-shouldered, solid, 11 years riding together, the kind of man who said what needed to be said and nothing else. "What's under there?" Boone said. "Don't know," the president said. But that was not entirely true. He not knew it the way you not know a thing you have refused to look at directly. He not knew it the way you not know a dream that dissolves the moment you try to hold it. The shape of the covered bike was familiar, the same way the apple pie had been familiar, and the woman behind the counter had been familiar without source, without explanation, with only the feeling itself. Pure and inexplicable. The way light arrives before you can see what it is showing you. He did not lift the canvas. He went back outside into the rain. The parking lot was empty. The highway was empty. The storm was delivering on everything it had promised all day, with the complete and impersonal commitment of weather and open country. He stood in it and let it soak through his jacket and run down his face and drip from the ends of his beard, and he looked at his right forearm. The tattoo was between his wrist and elbow on the inside of the arm. He had gotten it 10 years ago in a shop in Phoenix, had woken from the dream that came back most consistently, the dream with the smoke, and the woman's voice, the one in which a name was called that was not his name, and the coordinates had been there in his mind with the vividness of something remembered rather than imagined. He had driven to the shop before he had fully decided to, had given the address to the needle and watched it become permanent. He had never looked the coordinates up. He had told himself it did not matter where they pointed, that the dream was a dream. That a man who had spent his adult life with a wall in his memory, a wall around the months he had spent in a hospital in 1984 before the fire that had supposedly killed him, and certainly killed something, should not go pulling at threads that might not lead anywhere good. He had told himself this for 10 years. He looked at the tattoo now. He reached into his jacket and found his phone and opened the Maps application, and for the first time in 10 years he typed the numbers in. The map loaded. The pin dropped. He looked at the screen. Then he looked up at the building in front of him, at the neon sign in the window, its red and gold light throwing colors across the standing water in the parking lot, at the slightly uneven roofline, at the warm light of the interior visible through rain-streaked glass. Cross Junction Diner, Highway 40. The coordinates he had carried on his skin for 10 years. The coordinates from the dream he had never been able to stop, having pointed with the precision of a compass needle to the building directly in front of him. Cole lowered the phone. He had spent his adult life with a wall in his memory where the months before the fire should have been. This was the fact he had built everything on the absence that he had learned to function around, filling the gap with 25 years of the Desert Reapers. And before that, 3 years of Desert Storm. And before that, the foster home in Phoenix and the sealed paperwork and the identity that had been handed to him like a set of clothes that fit well enough if you didn't look too closely at where they came from. He had known the wall was there. He had decided deliberately and more than once that some doors were better left closed. That a man who had built himself from nothing needed to protect that construction. That whatever was behind the wall, if it was as dark as its edges suggested, was better left in the dark. He had made that decision year after year. He had made it until tonight. He put the phone back in his pocket. He stood in the rain and let his hands do what they were doing, which was shake quietly and without his permission, the way things shake when the pressure holding them still has been removed. Cole Maddox, 58 years old, president of the Desert Reapers, MC, Phoenix chapter, 300,000 miles of American highway behind him, veteran of a war in a desert on the other side of the world, a man who had been handed an identity at 18 years old in a foster home in Phoenix after surviving a fire that had killed 17 people and had been declared dead and had then been quietly, efficiently made into someone else. He stood in the parking lot of a diner whose coordinates were tattooed on his own skin and asked himself the question he had spent his adult life declining to ask. Who am I? The rain did not offer an opinion, but through the window of the Cross Junction Diner, the silhouette of Dorothy Harlan moved through the warm light, still working, still refilling, still burning with the specific quality of something that has decided it will not go out. And Cole looked at her and understood, in the weight of things understood in the body, before the mind catches up, that the answer to the question was in that building, that it had always been in that building, that the coordinates had known this for 10 years and he was the last to arrive at the knowledge. He took a breath. He walked back to the door and pushed it open. The warmth came over him, and with it, the smell of coffee and cinnamon and something older than both, and Dorothy looked up from behind the counter, and their eyes met, and this time for a reason neither of them could have articulated. Neither of them looked away. Not right away. The clock on the wall ticked its 5-minute slow rhythm, and outside on Highway 40 the rain kept coming indifferent and absolute the way it always had and always would, long after the people who had stood in it were gone and long after the reasons they had stood in it had been resolved or remained unresolved or had become simply and finally part of the ground they had been standing on all along. The storm had not lessened by midnight, and it showed no particular intention of doing so. Dorothy had sent Willa home at 10 over the girl's objections. There was nothing for Willa to do that Dorothy could not do herself, and there was something about the particular quality of this night that made Dorothy want fewer witnesses to whatever it was becoming. She could not have explained this to Willa in terms that would have made sense, so she did not try. She simply told her to drive carefully and lock her door and come in at 7, as usual. Willa had looked at the back of the diner at the men who had settled into the booths and the corners with the quiet competence of people who knew how to occupy a space without disturbing it, and she had looked at Dorothy and she had put on her coat and gone. 4 of the men were outside. Dorothy could see them occasionally when the lightning flashed posted at the corners of the parking lot and along the shoulder of the highway, standing in the rain without apparent complaint in the way of people for whom physical discomfort had long since ceased to register as a significant variable. They moved at intervals and communicated with each other in ways that were not visible from inside brief gestures. Nods. The organized silence of men who had done this kind of thing before. The 4 inside had arranged themselves with the same naturalness. Boone near the front window nursing coffee, his eyes on the highway. Griff and Dex in the far booth speaking in low voices about something that occasionally made Griff produce a short, compressed laugh that he cut off quickly as though remembering where he was. Harmon near the kitchen door, the youngest of them, at 41, who had the particular quality of stillness that some people develop when they have learned to be very patient with very dangerous situations. Cole sat at the counter. He had moved there from the booth sometime after Vance left, sometime after the shift in the quality of the room that Vance's arrival and departure had caused, and he had not explained the move, and no one had asked him to. He sat with his coffee in front of him, and his elbows on the counter, and his eyes on the window and the parking lot beyond it, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man working through something that required a great deal of room. Dorothy moved through her closing routines, wiping counters, covering the pie case, balancing the register. She did these things with the part of her that operated independently of thought or decision, the part that had run this diner for 42 years and could do it in complete darkness if required. The rest of her was attending to something else. Seamus had taken a booth by himself. He had his phone out, and he was making calls, or rather listening to calls, the phone pressed to his ear and his elbow on the table, and his other hand turning a coffee spoon, slowly end over end, the way a man turns something when his mind is very far from his hands. After the 3rd call, he set the phone face down on the table and sat for a moment with the spoon held still between his fingers, in an expression that Dorothy from across the room recognized the way you recognize certain expressions on certain faces, not because you know the person, but because you know what that particular arrangement of the human face means. She had worn it herself. It was the expression of someone who has just understood something that changes the shape of what they thought they knew. He stood up and walked to the counter. He did not sit down. He stood beside Cole and placed his phone on the counter between them and looked at it rather than at Cole the way people look at a thing they are about to explain rather than at the person they are explaining it to. "I made some calls," Seamus said. "Babushanan." Cole looked at the phone. "And, Desert Reapers MC Phoenix chapter." He paused. His voice was careful the way it was careful when he was controlling what it revealed. Founded 1985. Articles of incorporation filed with the state of Arizona. Founding member listed as a James Calloway of Phoenix, which is not a name attached to any person who actually existed, at least not any person who filed a tax return or carried a social security number or registered a vehicle in the state of Arizona. He paused again. The seed money for the chapter, the initial funds for the clubhouse, and the first 4 bikes registered to the club traced through 3 shell companies to a holding company called High Desert Holdings, LLC, incorporated in Delaware, dissolved 1991. Cole said nothing. High Desert Holdings, Seamus continued, was one of 14 shell companies operated between 1979 and 1994 by a man named Harold Vance, Warren Vance's father. He put the phone down flat. Who died of a heart attack in 2003 and left everything, including Vance Mineral Group, to his son. The room was very quiet for a moment except for the rain. Cole's hands were on the counter, not moving. There's more, Seamus said. Say it. The man who vouched for you, who brought you into the chapter in 1999. Freddie Tate. He stopped. Freddie Tate died in February of 2003, Cole. Single vehicle accident on 87 south of Payson. Came around a curve too fast at 2 in the morning, went over the guardrail. Investigated as an accident, closed in 3 weeks. He picked up the coffee spoon and set it down again. 3 months after Harold Vance died and 8 weeks before Warren Vance consolidated his holdings and became the sole beneficiary of everything his father had built. Cole turned the coffee cup slowly on the counter. Once around, a deliberate, controlled movement. How many, he said. Seamus knew what he was asking. He had known him 15 years. I count 7 based on who they answer to and where the money moves. Could be 8 out of 16 active members. He let that sit for a moment. Then in the same careful voice, not Boone, not Griff, Dex Harmon, not you and me. Cole looked up from the cup. He looked at the back of the room at Boone near the window and Griff and Dex in the far booth and Harmon by the kitchen door. 4 men who had ridden with him through things that had no good names. 4 men who had been chosen or guided or placed, and 4 men who had somewhere in the choosing become something that transcended the placement. Some things he had learned became real regardless of how they began. A lie told long enough in good faith became its own truth. A brotherhood built on a false foundation could still be a brotherhood if the men in it were real. Boone looked across the room at Cole. He crossed to the counter without being called because he had been watching, and he was Boone, and that was what Boone did. He stood on the other side of the counter from Seamus, and he looked at Cole, and he did not ask for an explanation. He waited. Someone built this chapter around me, Cole said. It came out flat and factual, the tone of a man who has decided that the way to carry a very heavy thing is to state its weight clearly rather than feel it all at once. Spent 25 years keeping eyes on me, making sure I stayed where I was. Didn't go looking for things I wasn't supposed to find. Boone processed this. His jaw tightened once and then was still. How much of the chapter, he said. Half. Boone was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then which half, not us, Seamus said. Boone looked at Cole. Cole held his gaze. Between them passed the particular weight of a loyalty that has just been tested in a way that was not academic, that had just become very concrete and consequential, and that had held. All right, Boone said. He did not say anything else about it. He did not need to. He went back to his position near the window and stood there with his coffee and his eyes on the parking lot, and his posture had changed in a small way that was nevertheless visible if you knew what you were looking at. He was not just watching the highway anymore. He was watching everything. Dorothy refilled Cole's cup for the 5th time that night. She did this because it was her reflex, her way of maintaining presence in a room without intruding on it. Cole accepted it the same way. She stayed a moment, cloth in hand, not quite leaving. There are things I should tell you, she said. Cole looked at her. There are things about Nathan, she said, about what happened to him. I've never told all of it to anyone, not the full account. She paused. My husband knew, but Roy has been gone 15 years, and there isn't anyone else who... She stopped. Restarted with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed this not for an audience, but for the specific disciplinary purpose of being able to get through it. I'd like to tell you if you want to hear it. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes in the low light of the late-night diner had gone very still. Sit down, he said. He said it quietly, and the quality of it was not a direction so much as a permission, as though he understood that what she was about to say required her to be off her feet. She came around the counter and sat on the stool beside his. She folded her hands on the counter in front of her, the way she had folded them 10,000 times, this particular arrangement of her hands, these particular hands that Roy had loved, that had made food for strangers for 4 decades, and had never quite stopped reaching for a boy who did not come back. She told it from the beginning. Nathan had graduated from high school in June of 1984. He had been 18 years old and had Roy's jaw and Dorothy's stubbornness and a specific passion for engines that had manifested at the age of 9 when he took apart a lawnmower motor to understand how it worked and had, to everyone's surprise, including his own, gotten it back together and had it running better than before. He had joined the Future Soldiers program at his high school and had planned with the clarity of purpose that some young men carry to enlist after graduation and train as a mechanic. He had been working that summer at a service station 12 miles down the highway and had been in the particular way of 18-year-old boys who are about to become something suspended in the last 2 weeks of being what he had always been before the larger story of his life began. On the afternoon of August 14th, 1984, he had driven to the Ponderosa Mall in Flagstaff. He was buying a birthday present for Dorothy. He had called her that morning and asked what she wanted, and she had said she did not need anything, and he had said that was not the question he had asked, and she had laughed, and it was the last time she heard him laugh. He had been in the parking lot walking toward the main entrance when he saw 3 men moving with purpose toward a car 2 rows over. And in the space between 2 parked cars he saw a child, a girl 7 years old with dark hair and a yellow dress and the specific quality of absolute stillness that a child achieves when fear has gone past the point of movement. Her name was Clara Ellison. She was the daughter of Senator Hargrove Ellison of Arizona, who was at that time in the middle of his second term in the United States Senate, and who had been until that afternoon the kind of public figure whose private life remained private in the way that distinguished public lives sometimes did in the years before the landscape of privacy changed entirely. Nathan had seen what he saw. He had been the only person in that section of the parking lot. He had not hesitated, Dorothy said, because hesitation was not something Nathan did when the situation required a decision, which was one of the things she had loved most about him and one of the things that had cost him everything. He had shouted. He had run toward the men. He had gotten close enough to get a hand on the car door before 2 of the men turned on him. He had fought them. He had the Harlan jaw and the Harlan stubbornness and the particular fearlessness of an 18-year-old who has not yet learned to properly weigh consequences, and he had given a reasonable account of himself before the 3rd man produced a weapon and changed the arithmetic. They had not shot him. That had been the thing Dorothy had turned over in her mind for 40 years, the specific fact that kept returning to complicate whatever theory she was building in the quiet hours of the night. They had not shot him. They had put him in the car with the girl and driven away, and Nathan had been seen by 2 witnesses entering the car under what was clearly not his own power, and those witnesses had reported what they saw, and then something had happened to the reports, and then something had happened to the witnesses, and then the machinery of a particular kind of power had begun to move. Within 72 hours, Nathan Harlan had been transferred. The word used was transferred, not committed, not admitted, but transferred as though he were a file to the Pinewood Institute, a private psychiatric facility outside Phoenix, on the authority of a county court order signed by a judge whose name Dorothy had subsequently spent 3 years trying to trace through the legal records and whose connections, when she finally found them, led in a direction that terrified her. The official account had described Nathan as suffering from a dissociative episode and presenting as a danger to himself and others. The official account had been signed by 2 physicians. Dorothy had tried to contact both of them. One had left the state. The other had died in 1987, and the nature of that death had also been described as natural in a way that Dorothy by that point had stopped believing about anything connected to this sequence of events. Roy had started digging the day after Nathan disappeared. He was a sheriff, which meant he had access to things that ordinary people did not, and he was also the kind of man who did not stop when told to stop, which was the quality that had made him an effective sheriff and that had ultimately been the thing that killed him. He had found Harold Vance. He had found the connections between Harold Vance and the judge who had signed Nathan's commitment order, the connections between Harold Vance and 2 of the 3 men whose descriptions Nathan had given to the police before his testimony was formally retracted by the psychiatric facility on the grounds that he was not competent to provide it. He had found a thread that, when pulled, led through the layers of legitimate business and documented philanthropy and carefully maintained social standing that Harold Vance had constructed over 2 decades to something underneath it that was not any of those things. Roy had been dead for 3 weeks after that. A semi-truck had run a red light in Flagstaff at 7 in the evening on a Tuesday and had hit Roy's patrol car on the driver's side at an estimated speed of 62 miles per hour. The truck driver had been gone from the scene before the first responding unit arrived. The truck had been reported stolen from a yard in Albuquerque 2 days prior. The investigation had been handled by the state police rather than the county, at the request of a senior official whose name Dorothy had also written in a notebook she kept in the back of the safe beneath the register, the notebook she had been adding to for 40 years. The Pinewood Institute had burned on a Thursday night in October of 1984, 11 days after Roy's death. The fire had been ruled accidental, an electrical fault in the basement. 17 patients and 3 staff members had died. The investigation had been conducted by the state fire marshal's office. The records had been sealed under a provision that Dorothy's attorney at the time had described as unusual, but not unprecedented for facilities handling sensitive psychiatric cases. Nathan Harlan had been declared dead on November 3, 1984, on the basis of the fire marshal's determination that the remains found in room 14 of the Pinewood Institute were consistent with the physical description on file. No DNA testing. DNA testing was not available in 1984 in the way it would come to be. No dental records match. The Pinewood Institute's records had been among those destroyed in the fire. No body in any sense that Dorothy was willing to accept as her son. She had never accepted it. Had said so to every official who would hear her and to several who would not for the first 5 years. After 5 years, she had stopped saying it out loud to people who were not going to listen, but she had not stopped knowing it. She had known it with the certainty of a mother, which was a certainty that existed at a level below argument, in evidence, in official documentation, the level at which the body simply knows what it knows. She had opened the diner every morning. She had left the light on. She had waited. Dorothy finished speaking. The rain was the only sound for a moment, the rain against the windows and the wind in the eaves and the particular settling quiet of a building that has been standing in the desert long enough to become part of the landscape. Cole had not moved. His hands were on the counter still. His face had the quality that Seamus in 15 years had learned to read with care, the expression of a man compressing something that if released would require a great deal of space. He had learned that expression in the desert of Iraq and had worn it to varying degrees for most of the years since. Seamus from his nearby stool was looking at the counter. The coffee spoon was still in his hand. He had stopped turning it. It was Seamus who spoke first because that was the role he occupied, the one who could be trusted to move the room when the room needed moving. "This Vance," he said. His voice was careful with the care of a man constructing something that needs to bear weight. "Harold Vance, he's dead, you said." "Since 2003, Dorothy said, and his son inherited everything. Everything, including whatever arrangements Harold had made regarding," he paused, chose the word with visible care, "regarding people whose continued existence required management." Dorothy looked at him. The word was clinical, and she recognized it as such, and she received it that way, which told Seamus something about the quality of this woman's particular kind of strength. She had been living with the clinical version of these events for 40 years. She did not flinch at the language. "Yes," she said. Seamus set the spoon down. He looked at Cole. Cole had not turned from the window. "The chapter," Cole said. The words came out flat and quiet. "A life built around managing me, making sure I never got close to any of this." He paused. "Why not just—" He did not finish the sentence. "Because a dead witness is a martyr," Dorothy said. She had thought about this for 40 years. She had reached this conclusion on her own in the middle of the night, in the years after Roy died, when she had sat in this diner with a pot of coffee and a notebook and tried to understand the specific logic of what had been done to her family. A living one without a memory is something else, something controllable, something you can— She stopped. "Use if you need to, silence if you need to, move if the situation requires it." The fluorescent light above the counter hummed its single sustained note. Boone appeared at the edge of the room. He had been at the window. He moved with a deliberate quietness that indicated something had changed in what he was seeing through the glass. "President." His voice was very even. Cole turned. "Car on the shoulder, east side about 200 yards out. Parked. No lights. Been there 12 minutes." He paused. "It's not the same one that was there earlier." The room changed. It did not change in any way that was visible or audible. No one moved quickly. No voices were raised. But something shifted in the quality of attention in the space. A drawing and a focusing the way a lens adjusts to bring something distant into clarity. And the 4 men inside the diner and the 4 men outside it became in the span of a breath something different from what they had been a moment before. Cole was off the stool. He looked at Dorothy. His expression was very clear and very direct. "Back of the kitchen," he said. "There's a door. I know my own building. Go to it. Stay inside. Don't come out until I say." Dorothy looked at him. Then she did something she had not expected to do that surprised her even as she was doing it. She reached out and put her hand briefly on his forearm, just for a moment, her small hand on his scarred forearm above the tattooed coordinates, and then she removed it and walked to the kitchen without looking back. Cole watched her go. The expression on his face in the moment after her hand left his arm was something that Seamus, watching from 3 feet away, had never seen on that face before. He filed it without commenting on it and drew his weapon from the small of his back and checked the chamber with the practiced motion of a man who has done this so many times it has become a form of breathing. What happened next took less than 4 minutes and contained enough violence to last considerably longer in the memory. They came from two directions, which was professional. The cars on the highway and the ones that had come in from the county road to the north, cutting the lights before they turned, which was also professional. The men who got out were wearing tactical gear and carrying automatic weapons, which settled definitively. And finally, the question of whether Warren Vance was the kind of man who sent warning shots or the kind who sent finalities. There were 12 of them, 8 outside and 4 who came through the windows. The windows came first. Boone went down on one knee behind the counter and returned fire with the accuracy of a man who had learned to shoot in places where inaccuracy had immediate consequences. Griff upended a booth table and used it for cover and fired twice through the east window and was answered by the sound of someone on the other side of it who had stopped having problems of their own. Dex was moving before the first glass hit the floor, pulling Harmon with him toward the kitchen, and the kitchen door was solid wood and old, and it held when the second burst of fire raked across it, and the chapter turned. This was the thing that happened in the middle of the other things, and it was in some ways worse than the things that had a cleaner logic. 5 men who had been sitting in booths, who had ridden 300 miles in the rain alongside the people who were now firing back through the windows, stood up and oriented themselves toward the interior of the building rather than the threat coming through the glass. Boone saw it first. He turned in the same motion with which he came up from the counter and fired once, and the first man to raise a weapon at a brother went down, and then the room was a geometry of violence that had no clear orientation, threat from outside and threat from inside occupying the same space, and the 4 men who were clean made the decisions that the situation required. It lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, the diner looked like something that had been argued with by a determined storm. The windows were gone, 2 booths were overturned. The pie case had a hole in it that would have made Dorothy furious under other circumstances. On the floor were bodies, some of them the men who had come through the windows, and some of them the men who had decided in the last moments of a set of bad decisions to go against people who had built their lives on knowing which side of a door to stand on. Boone was bleeding from the shoulder. He had pressed a dishcloth against it with the patient competence of someone who has dealt with worse and knew that this was not the situation to use the phone. Griff was bleeding from a cut above his eye that was going to need stitches at some point and was currently providing him with a dramatic quality that he was too experienced to notice. Dex and Harmon were uninjured, which was its own kind of evidence about the specific quality of their judgment in tight situations. Seamus was on the floor. Cole was beside him before the last of the outside fire had completely stopped moving with the speed of the absolute priority, the hierarchy of the moment that placed Seamus above everything else. He pressed his hands against Seamus's chest where the blood was coming from, and he felt the volume of it, and he said a thing very quietly, not a prayer and not a curse, more like a verdict, delivered to the situation by a man who was not willing to accept its terms. Seamus opened his eyes. His face had gone the color of old paper. His breathing was the careful, rationed breathing of someone who has learned in the last 30 seconds that breathing requires conscious management. But his eyes were sharp. They had not changed. "The others," he said. "Handled," Cole said. He pressed harder. "Don't talk. I need to say something." Seamus's voice had found a register that was different from his ordinary voice. Lower, more deliberate. The voice of a man who is spending his words with care because he is not certain how many he has left. "Cole, listen to me. Irish, listen." His hand came up and closed around Cole's wrist, the grip strong in the way of last things. "You are Nathan Harlan." He said it the way you say the thing that needs to be the last thing said if it turns out there is only one more thing. "Son of Roy Harlan, son of Dorothy Harlan. Those are the only coordinates that matter." His breathing hitched, recovered. "They took 40 years from you. Don't you let them take what comes next." "You're not going anywhere," Cole said. "No." Something moved across Seamus's face that was almost a smile. "But I wanted to say it first, in case." His grip on Cole's wrist tightened once brief and deliberate. "Call the ambulance, and don't do anything stupid while they're loading me in." Cole looked at him. The instruction about the ambulance was already being carried out by Harmon behind him. He could hear the call. He held Seamus's gaze and he held the pressure on his chest, and he said in the voice he used when he meant something absolutely, "That's an order. You stay." Seamus looked at him, closed his eyes. Open them. Yes, sir, he said, faint and clear, and with the precise quality of a man who intends to comply. The ambulance came from Flagstaff. 17 minutes, which was as fast as 17 minutes had ever felt. Cole rode with it in the parking lot until the paramedics were doing their work and Boone had his shoulder looked at by the second paramedic who arrived and Seamus was secured and the bag was squeezing and the vehicle was ready to move. Cole stood in the parking lot and watched the ambulance until its lights were gone into the rain. Then he went inside. Dorothy was standing at the kitchen door. She had come out when the shooting stopped, which was earlier than he had told her to, which did not surprise him in the least. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at the dining room with the expression of a person taking inventory. Not of the damage, of what remained. She looked at Cole. Seamus alive. Flagstaff General. She breathed. A single controlled release. The others, Boone's shoulder. Griff needs stitches. The rest are fine. She looked at what remained of her dining room. The overturned booths, the shattered glass, the holes in the walls where the drywall had accepted rounds that had been intended for other purposes. The pie case with its new opening to the weather. Well, she said, and then she stopped. There was not much to add to that. Cole crossed the room and picked up 2 overturned chairs and set them right with the particular care of a man who needed to do something with his hands. Dorothy went behind the counter and found the broom and began sweeping glass without being asked and without making anything of it. They worked in silence for a while, cleaning what could be cleaned, moving what could be moved, leaving the rest for daylight and whatever came after this. Boone appeared in the doorway to the back. Federal vehicle on 40, he said, coming slow. Cole set down the chair he had been straightening. Agent Dale Pruitt of the FBI Phoenix Field Office was 55 years old and had the particular quality of a man who had spent 30 years in a job that required him to be the least dramatic person in any dramatic situation. He was medium height, gray-haired, with a face that had developed over 3 decades of interviewing people who did not want to be interviewed into an expression of neutral patient attention that revealed nothing about what he thought and everything about the fact that he intended to keep thinking until he arrived at something useful. He walked through what had been the front window of the Crease Junction diner, since the window itself was no longer an obstacle, and he looked at the room and at the people in it and at the several bodies that were still arranged on the floor in the positions they had arrived at. And he did not visibly react to any of it in the manner of a man who had made peace long ago with the range of things that human beings were capable of. His eyes found Cole. He had been told what Cole looked like. He had a file on Cole that was a subset of a larger file that he had been building for 4 years and that had not yet produced anything that a federal prosecutor would look at without suggesting he come back when he had something more concrete, which was the perpetual condition of investigating men like Warren Vance, who understood that the purpose of an organization's visible surface was to give investigators something to look at that was not the part of the organization that mattered. Cole Maddox, Pruitt said. Pruitt, Cole said. He had not moved from where he was standing, which was in the center of the dining room, where he had a clear view of all the entrances. You've been watching Vance. It was not a question. Pruitt did not treat it as one. 4 years, Pruitt said. Money laundering, tax evasion on a significant scale, potential RICO elements going back to his father's operations. He paused. I've never had anything that stuck. He's careful. He's been careful for a long time. He sent 12 men tonight. I know, I heard it happen. He said this without particular inflection. I was 3 miles out, came as fast as the situation allowed without alerting whoever he has on his payroll in the county sheriff's office. Cole looked at him steadily. You've been watching this diner, Cole said. Pruitt did not look away. I became aware of your presence here at approximately 9 this evening when a vehicle associated with Vance's security detail ran the plates on your bikes in the parking lot and the inquiry came through a system I monitor. He paused. I drove out to assess the situation. I was still assessing it when the situation assessed itself. Dorothy from behind the counter said nothing. She was watching Pruitt with the specific attention of a woman who had spent 40 years evaluating people who wore the authority of official positions and had learned to distinguish between those for whom that authority was a tool and those for whom it was a costume. Pruitt looked at her. Mrs. Harlan. He said it was something that was not quite deference and not quite sympathy and was actually something harder to describe, which was a specific kind of recognition of what a person had carried and for how long. I am aware of the history of your case, your husband's investigation. What happened in 1984? He paused. I am sorry that it took this long. Dorothy looked at him for a moment. "Are you in a position to do anything about it now?" she said. "Or are you going to tell me you need more time and more evidence and come back when you have something that will stick?" Pruitt almost smiled. It was a brief and restrained expression, but it was genuine. "I'm going to tell you," he said, "that what happened tonight changed the calculus considerably. 12 armed men in tactical gear attacking a roadside diner on a federal highway is the kind of thing that generates its own documentation regardless of whatever arrangements Mr. Vance has made in the county system." He looked at Cole. "But I need more than tonight. Tonight is destruction of property and attempted murder. It establishes a pattern, but it doesn't reach what this has been about for 40 years. It doesn't give me Clara Ellison. It doesn't give me what was done to this man." He indicated Cole with a brief, specific gesture. "And it doesn't give me the foundation of what Harold Vance built and his son inherited. To get that, I need Vance to talk." Cole looked at him. "He won't talk," Cole said. "Not if he thinks he's at risk. No." Pruitt's expression had the quality of a man arriving at the thing he came to say. "But if he believes the problem has been contained, if he believes that tonight was a success from his perspective, that you've been taken off the board." Cole was quiet. "You want to arrest me," he said, "publicly, visibly, tomorrow morning in a way that generates a news cycle. Hell's Angels president arrested in connection with a highway diner attack. Multiple casualties. Federal custody. He will see it because I will make sure he sees it, and he will conclude that the threat has been neutralized, and he will begin, however carefully, to behave like a man who no longer believes he is being watched. And then you're released on a technicality. Witness issue. Something that takes 48 hours to resolve. And in those 48 hours, you go to him, wired, and you get him to say what he's been hiding for 40 years. Pruitt looked at him without blinking. "It's not a clean plan." "No," Cole said. "It's not. It's the one that works." Cole looked at Dorothy. She was watching him with the expression of a woman who understood what was being proposed and was performing the specific calculation of its cost against its potential. She had been performing calculations like this for 40 years. She was very good at them. Then he looked at Boone, who was leaning against the wall with his shoulder bandaged and his arms crossed, and his expression that of a man who had already decided he was in, who was simply waiting for the direction. "If I go in," Cole said, "and he decides it's cleaner to put me down on the spot, we'll have agents positioned, 3 blocks, thermal imaging on the building. Any indication that the situation has escalated beyond recovery, we're inside in 90 seconds. 90 seconds is a long time." "Yes," Pruitt said simply. "It is." Cole turned away, walked to the window, the empty frame where the window had been, and stood looking out at the rain in the parking lot and the highway beyond it. The lights of the ambulance were long gone. Somewhere in Flagstaff, Seamus was in a surgical suite with people working to close the hole in his chest, doing the specific and necessary work of keeping one more person in the world against the pressures that were arguing against it. "Don't do anything stupid while they're loading me in." He turned back. "There's a condition," he said. Pruitt waited. "She goes north tonight. Flagstaff. A room under a name Vance doesn't know. She stays there until this is finished." He looked at Dorothy. "Non-negotiable." Dorothy opened her mouth. "Non-negotiable," Cole said again. Not with loudness, with the specific quality of finality that did not require volume to be absolute. Dorothy closed her mouth. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had walked through her door 8 hours ago, and who had in those 8 hours become something she did not have a word for yet, something she had been waiting 40 years to find a word for. "All right," she said, quietly, with a dignity that was its own form of agreement. Cole nodded. He looked at Pruitt. "How do you want to do this?" The arrest happened at 7:15 the following morning in the parking lot of the Cross Junction Diner, in full view of the 3 local news vehicles that Agent Pruitt had ensured were aware of the situation through channels that were not quite official and were not quite not. Cole came out of the diner with his hands up and Agent Pruitt behind him with handcuffs and the particular performance quality of a federal officer making a public arrest that was designed to be seen. 2 additional federal vehicles were on the shoulder of Highway 40 with their lights going. A third had blocked the county road entrance to the parking lot. Cole walked to the vehicle without resisting. He was placed in the back. The door closed. Through the vehicle's window, he could see the diner, the shattered windows, the marks on the walls. The neon sign that was still on, still doing its red and gold, the O, still blinking in its particular rhythm. It would need to come down. The building would need to be repaired. What Dorothy had built over 42 years would need to be rebuilt. He had done that before. Built things from the ground up out of the materials available out of what remained after the fire. He knew how it was done. The vehicle pulled out of the parking lot. On the highway, it turned west toward Phoenix. 3 hours north in a motel room in Flagstaff that she had paid for in cash under a name from her girlhood that no one living had any reason to connect to her, Dorothy Harlan sat on the edge of a bed with a shotgun on the pillow beside her and the Bible on her lap open to the same page it always opened to, the page she had been reading for 40 years, the story of the son who went away and the father who waited and the moment when the distance between them finally at great cost collapsed. She read it slowly the way she always read it. Outside, the rain had stopped. In Phoenix, the news was beginning to run, and Warren Vance, in the sitting room of a house that had been paid for by 40 years of secrets, poured himself a bourbon and looked at the screen and allowed himself for the first time in 3 days to relax. The Long Road Home Part 3. Coming home, the Vance estate sat on 22 acres of land northwest of Phoenix that Harold Vance had purchased in 1971 for reasons that had nothing to do with privacy and everything to do with the specific geometry of wealth in Arizona, which was that the land between the city and the mountains was worth very little in 1971 and worth a great deal more by the time anyone else understood that it would be. The house that Warren had built on it after his father's death was the kind of structure that expressed its cost without advertising it, which was a more sophisticated form of the same statement that cheaper houses made louder. Long horizontal lines, glass and stone, lights that came on at dusk with the precision of a stage being set. The gates were iron, 12 feet. There was a guardhouse at the entrance and a camera on every corner of the perimeter wall and motion sensors along the interior ground that Pruitt's surveillance team had been cataloging for 2 years. The driveway from the gate to the front entrance was 300 yards of smooth concrete lined with desert plantings that had been selected and maintained by a firm that charged more per month than most people in the state earned in a year. Cole rode up to the gate at 9:17 in the evening on a borrowed Harley that Boone had arranged through a contact in Tempe, because Cole's own bike was evidence in a federal matter and would remain so for some time. He stopped at the intercom and sat for a moment in the particular quality of quiet that exists in the space before a thing begins, when everything that is going to happen is still only potential, still arranged in possibilities rather than facts. He pressed the button. The voice that came through was male and careful. Security, not staff. "Mr. Maddox," not a question. They had been watching him come up the road. "Mr. Vance is expecting you." The gates opened. Cole rode through. Warren Vance was standing in the entrance hall when the front door opened. He was in a dark shirt and slacks, no jacket, a glass of bourbon in his left hand, and he looked in the first moment of that encounter less like the man who had appeared in a roadside diner with 4 men and a folder full of intentions than like the man he might have been if his father had been a different kind of person. There was something in his posture in that unguarded first second, something tired and not entirely comfortable with itself. And then he saw Cole, and the posture adjusted and the practiced quality returned, and he smiled the smile that had cost a great deal of money and a lifetime of practice to produce. "Nathan," he said, "or Cole, either one best." "Either one works," Cole said. He came through the door and stood in the entrance hall and looked at the room the way he always looked at rooms' corners, to exits to people to layout. 2 security men visible. More elsewhere. The staircase to the left. The corridor to the right leading toward what the floor plan that Pruitt had obtained from the county records suggested was a study and a secondary sitting room. The room he was standing in was large and expensively appointed and had the quality of spaces that are designed to communicate something to the people who enter them, which was that the person who lived here had more than you and had always had more than you and intended to continue having more than you for the foreseeable future. Cole was not particularly impressed by rooms. "You came," Vance said. There was something in his voice that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction. A third thing, the quality of a man who had placed a bet and was watching the outcome arrive. "You knew I would. I thought you might. You have your father's stubbornness." He paused. Roy Harlan was a stubborn man. It got him killed, but he was stubborn. He said it without obvious cruelty, which was in some ways worse than cruelty, the tone of someone for whom this fact had been processed long ago and filed in the category of historical outcomes. "You want to tell me why I'm still alive," Cole said, "after 40 years. Vance turned and walked toward the sitting room, a gesture of invitation that was also a statement of confidence, the willingness to turn your back on someone as an expression of certainty about the power relationship. Cole followed him. The sitting room was warm and lamplit, a fire in a gas fireplace. 2 chairs arranged facing each other at a distance that suggested they had been placed that way deliberately, which they had. Vance settled into one and indicated the other with the bourbon glass. Cole sat down. He did not lean back. 3 blocks away, in the parking lot of a closed hardware store, Agent Dale Pruitt sat in a surveillance van with 2 analysts and a communications specialist and a recording system that was picking up the wire on Cole's body with a clarity that was doing its job. Pruitt had a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and an expression that had not changed in 2 hours, which was the expression of a man conducting an exercise in patience that he could not afford to fail. Boone Dex and Harmon were parked 2 streets east of the estate perimeter in a truck that Griff had borrowed from a man he knew in Scottsdale. They were not part of the plan as Pruitt had articulated it. They were there because they were Boone Dex and Harmon, and the plan, as Cole had explained it to them, had not included the part where they were absent. Vance poured a second bourbon from a decanter on the side table. He set the glass in front of Cole without asking whether Cole wanted it. Cole did not touch it. "My father built a business," Vance said. He said it the way a man begins something he has been carrying for a long time, with the cadence of a story that has been told internally many times and is only now being spoken aloud. Not all of it was legal. Very little of it was, if we are being specific. The mining was legal, the rest of it was the scaffolding that held the mining up while it became what it became. He looked at the fire. Influence, arrangements, the management of situations that would otherwise have become problems. The management of people, Cole said. Sometimes. He said it without apology. In 1984, a situation arose that required management. A child was taken. Her father was a man whose influence overlapped with my father's in ways that were inconvenient. It was meant to be a transaction, a negotiation conducted outside of normal channels. She died. Vance was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression that was not performance, a genuine disruption of the surface the way water moves when something stirs it from below. "She died during the process," he said, "not as a result of any decision. She died because the people responsible for her physical welfare were not careful, and the compound they used was at a concentration they had misjudged." He paused. "She was not supposed to die. That was not part of any arrangement." "Tell that to her father," Cole said. "Her father never knew who was responsible. That was the point of the management." Vance looked at him. "Your mother's son was a complication. He was in the wrong place at a moment when wrong places had very serious consequences. My father made a decision about how to handle the complication." He paused. "It was not a decision I was consulted about. I was 14 years old." Cole looked at him, steady, patient. "But you knew about it." A silence. "I knew about it," Vance said. "You knew what had been done to me, what had been done to my father. You inherited an operation that had been built in part to manage my continued existence, and you maintained it." Vance picked up his bourbon and held it without drinking. "I was 24 years old when my father sat me down and explained the structure of what I was inheriting, the legitimate parts and the other parts. By that point, the legitimate parts were worth enough that the choice was not between good and bad. It was between walking away from everything that I was, everything that had been built, and doing what was necessary to protect it." He looked at the fire. "I chose the latter." "You could have let it go," Cole said. "After Harold died, you could have dismantled it, left me alone." "I could have," Vance said. "And for the first few years I considered it. You were in the military, Desert Storm. You were functioning. You had no memory of any of it. The simplest outcome was that you lived your life and I lived mine, and the distance between us remained." He paused. "But I was 24 years old and afraid, and I made the choice that afraid young men with access to their father's tools make, which was to use the tools." Cole looked at him for a long moment. "Show me the video," he said. Vance looked at him. Something shifted. "You know about the video. Show me." Vance set down the bourbon. He stood and went to the desk against the wall and opened a laptop and brought it back and placed it on the coffee table between them. He opened a file. He turned the screen toward Cole. Cole looked at it. It was grainy, the quality of footage filmed in low light with equipment that was 40 years old, transferred presumably multiple times through multiple formats, so that what remained was several generations removed from whatever original recording had existed. The timestamp in the corner read October 9th, '84, which was 3 days before the fire. The location appeared to be interior institutional quarters, in a room with the particular quality of light that came from overhead fluorescence in buildings that did not spend money on the comfort of the people inside them. A young man, 18 years old in a hospital gown, dark hair, strong jaw, eyes that were not right, that had a quality to them that Cole had seen before in other contexts, and recognized the flat, compliant look of someone whose neurological landscape had been chemically rearranged without their consent. He was in a room with a child. Cole watched the video. He watched it to the end. When it was finished, he looked up from the screen and looked at Vance. "That's supposed to be me," he said. "It is you. You're certain of that." "I have been certain of that for 40 years, Vance said. He said it with something in his voice that Cole was trying to locate and categorize. Not triumph, not threat, something more complicated. "It is the primary reason that you were managed rather than removed. Because that video exists. Because if you remembered, if you ever came close to remembering, if you ever found your way back to the situation." He paused. "That video was the insurance." Cole looked at the screen, at the young man with the empty eyes, at the small figure in the room with him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at Vance and said quietly, "That video is a lie." Vance looked at him, a different quality of attention, now assessing, recalibrating. "I watched it," Cole said. "I saw what it shows. And I am telling you that it is a lie." He paused. "You want to know how I know? Not because I remember. I don't remember most of what happened in that building. The drugs and the procedures they used made sure of that, and I have spent my adult life with a wall in my memory where those months should be." He paused again. His voice had the quality, it sometimes had the quality that Seamus had described once without irony as the voice of a man who has decided what is true and intends to stay decided. "I know it's a lie because of my mother." Vance waited. Dorothy Harlan waited 40 years for her son. She opened that diner every morning and made the coffee and kept the light on and did not stop for a single day. She did not stop when they told her I was dead. She did not stop when they gave her a sealed report and a closed case and every official mechanism available to tell her that the answer to her question was finished. Cole looked at him steadily. A woman who raised a killer does not wait 40 years with that kind of faith. She knew who her son was. She has known every day for 40 years, and that knowledge is worth more than any video you can put on a screen. The fire moved in the grate. Outside, somewhere in the manicured darkness of the estate grounds, a security man was making his rounds. The measured footsteps of someone performing a function he had performed so many times it had become invisible to him. Vance looked at Cole for a long moment. Then he said, "You came here to get me to confirm it." "Yes." "The wire." "Yes." Vance was quiet. He looked at the bourbon glass. He looked at the fire. He looked at the laptop screen, where the video was still open, its final frame frozen in the grainy half-dark of a building that had burned to the ground 38 years ago. Cole watched his face. And then Vance did something that Cole had not anticipated, that Pruitt 3 blocks away had not anticipated, that changed the quality of everything that followed, because it was not the thing that men in Vance's position were supposed to do, which was to reach for the phone or reach for the weapon or produce one of the several remaining forms of leverage that a man with his resources could still produce. He closed the laptop. He looked at Cole. "My father told me," he said, "that the boy in that video was responsible for the death of Clara Ellison. He told me the video was documentation, that it had been made to ensure that the boy could never speak about what he knew because the speaking would produce evidence of what he had done." He paused. His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it, some long-held tension, as though a wire that had been stretched for 4 decades had finally reached the limit of its tensile strength. "I have believed that for 40 years. I have made decisions based on it. I have maintained an entire architecture of secrecy and management and occasional violence based on the truth of that story." He looked at the closed laptop. 3 weeks ago, I found a document in my father's papers that I had not found before. A handwritten note, his handwriting, dated October 12th, 1984. He reached inside his shirt pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, old, the kind of old that comes from handling rather than age alone, the soft-edged, worn quality of paper that has been taken out and looked at and folded and put back many times over many years. He placed it on the coffee table between them. Cole looked at it, did not pick it up. "He wrote it for himself," Vance said. "Not for me, for himself. The way men write things they need to say but cannot say to another person." He looked at the paper. "It says that the girl died before the boy was brought to her, that the compound was administered incorrectly, that the boy was brought in afterward and the documentation was created to serve as insurance, that the boy did not harm her." He paused, a long pause, the kind that contains 40 years. "He wrote it in a private notebook that I found in a box of his personal effects that had been in storage since 2003. I do not think he intended it to be found. I think he wrote it because he needed to say the truth somewhere, even if that somewhere was a piece of paper in a box in a storage unit. Cole looked at him. Vance looked back. I have spent 3 weeks, Vance said, trying to decide what to do with that information. His voice was very quiet now, stripped of the practiced quality. What was underneath it was not what Cole had expected to find. Not cruelty, not calculation. Something that had been carried for so long, it had become part of the skeleton the way damage becomes structural over enough time. I'm telling you now, without the benefit of the wire because I know you're wearing one, or with it I no longer particularly care. I am telling you that you did not kill her. You were never in a position to kill her. And I have spent 40 years managing a secret that was built on a document that my father wrote to himself because he needed to acknowledge what was true, even if he could not say it. The fire burned. The room was very quiet. Then Cole picked up the folded paper. He opened it. He looked at the handwriting inside. He set it back on the table. Where is she? Cole said. Clara Ellison. Vance looked at the fire. Under the foundation of the Cross Junction Diner, he said, the eastern corner. She has been there since November of 1984. In the surveillance van 3 blocks away, Pruitt said something quietly to the analyst beside him. He picked up the radio. Move in, he said. The federal vehicles came through the gate with the quiet efficiency of organizations that have been preparing for a particular moment for a long time and are not inclined toward drama when the moment arrives. 6 vehicles, agents in tactical gear, and agents in suits, the full range of what a federal operation brings to a situation that has been building for 4 years and has just resolved itself into something actionable. Cole was standing in the entrance hall when they came through the door. He had not moved from the sitting room until he heard them on the drive, and then he had stood up and walked to the entrance and stood there with his hands visible at his sides, which was the correct thing to do when a significant number of people with federal credentials and tactical equipment were about to enter a building. Pruitt came through the door and saw Cole, and they looked at each other for a moment with the specific mutual recognition of 2 people who have run a significant risk together and have arrived together at the other side of it. He gave you the document, Pruitt said. It was not a question. He had heard it. He gave me the document, Cole said. Pruitt looked at the piece of paper in Cole's hand and then looked at Cole's face and then looked past him toward the sitting room where Warren Vance was still seated in the chair beside the fire, his bourbon untouched, his hands folded in his lap with the quality of a man who has put down something he has been carrying for a very long time and is in the process of discovering what it feels like to stand without the weight. 2 agents moved past Cole and into the sitting room. He heard them identifying themselves, heard the formal language of federal procedure, the reading of rights, the careful architecture of a legal process that had been 40 years in the making and was now finally in motion. Then he heard Vance's voice. I understand, Vance said to the agents. The voice was still composed. The voice of a man who had made a decision and was on the other side of it. Then directed past the agents directed at Cole in the entrance hall, he said, the boy in that video, he's not guilty of anything. A pause. Neither is she. Her father should know that. She didn't suffer. Whatever else happened, she didn't suffer. The agents guided him toward the door. He passed Cole in the entrance hall, and they looked at each other, these 2 men whose lives had been arranged around the same absence for 40 years, the one who had shaped the absence and the one who had been shaped by it. Cole looked at him for a long moment. Your father trapped you, Cole said, when you were 14 years old and didn't know what you were agreeing to. Vance looked at him. Something in his face acknowledged this without claiming it as a defense. I had other choices after that, Vance said. I knew that. I made them anyway. Cole said nothing. I'm sorry, Vance said. That's not adequate. But it's what I have. The agents moved him out through the door and into the evening air of the estate grounds and toward one of the federal vehicles in the driveway. Cole stood in the entrance of the house that 40 years of secrets had paid for and watched them go. Pruitt appeared at his shoulder. The document is evidence, Pruitt said. But we already have what we need on the wire. The document is additional confirmation. He paused. It will be enough. And Clara, we'll begin an excavation of the diner property at first light. I have a forensic team standing by. He paused. It will take as long as it takes. We'll be thorough. Cole looked at the driveway, at the iron gate at the far end of it standing open now, federal vehicles on the other side of it, and the dark Arizona night beyond them. Senator Ellison, Cole said. I'll go to him myself, tonight. Pruitt said it with the weight of a man who has delivered difficult news many times and has not found a way to make it lighter and has stopped trying to find one thus. He deserves to hear it from a person rather than a broadcast. Cole nodded. He walked out through the front door of the Vance estate and into the night, and behind him the agents moved through the rooms with their documentation and their evidence bags and the careful machinery of accountability that had been 40 years in arriving. At the gate, Boone was waiting. He was leaning against the truck with his arms crossed and his shoulder wrapped and his face carrying the expression of a man who has been through the night that they had both been through and has come out the other side with his intentions intact. He looked at Cole. Cole looked back. They did not say anything for a moment. "Seamus," Cole said. "Called the hospital 20 minutes ago. Out of surgery. They say he'll need 6 weeks." Boone paused. He told the nurse to tell whoever called that 6 weeks was acceptable but 8 was not, and he expected to be on a bike by spring. Cole looked at the night sky above the edge of the estate wall, the specific quality of the Arizona desert sky after a storm cleared and deep full of stars that had nothing to do with anything that had just happened and would continue being there long after it no longer mattered. "Let's go," Cole said. She heard the knock at 3 in the morning. She had been awake for all of it, which was not a surprise. Sleep was not something she had planned for that night. She had sat on the edge of the motel bed in Flagstaff with the Bible open on her lap and the shotgun on the pillow beside her, and the particular quality of alertness that a person maintains when they are waiting for either a very good thing or a very bad thing and do not yet know which one is coming. The room was small, standard highway motel, the kind that had been built in the era when the highway itself was the destination, and the road was the experience before the interstate took the traffic and left the old alignment to the travelers who were going somewhere specific rather than just going. The curtains were the particular shade of beige that motel curtains had been for 40 years in every motel she had ever stayed in. The heater under the window cycled on and off with a clicking sound that had a rhythm to it she had cataloged and stopped hearing sometime around midnight. She heard the knock. 3 knocks. Spaced. Not frantic. She set the Bible on the nightstand. She picked up the shotgun. She went to the door and stood to the side of it the way Roy had taught her 30 years ago as a matter of ordinary domestic security, and said, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, "Mom, it's me, Dorothy Harlan, 78 years old, widow of Roy Harlan, mother of Nathan Harlan, who had been gone for 40 years, stood on her side of a motel room door in Flagstaff, Arizona, and felt the 40 years rearrange themselves into something that was not less heavy, but was differently arranged the way a great weight becomes manageable, not when it is removed, but when it is finally, after a very long time, set down in the right place. She unlocked the door. She opened it. He was standing in the parking lot light, and he was covered in the evidence of the night, the dust and the long hours and the particular worn quality of a person who has traveled a significant distance to arrive at a specific place, and his eyes, when she saw them, were different from the eyes that had come through her diner door 14 hours ago. Not lighter, not easier, but settled in the way of something that has found its level after a long time of seeking it. Dorothy Harlan did not speak. She stepped out through the doorway, and she put her arms around her son. He was very large, and she was very small, and she was 78 years old, and he was 58 years old, and it had been 40 years, and there was no form of arithmetic that adequately described what that meant. She held him the way she had held him when he was small and frightened, and the world had been too large, and the strange and specific truth of that moment was that her arms still knew how that the body retains some kinds of knowledge past the reach of time or distance or the official erasure of records. He put his arms around her. They stood in the parking lot in the Flagstaff night and held each other in the way of people who have found their way back to something they were afraid was lost, and the silence between them was not empty. After a while, Dorothy pulled back enough to look at him. She put her hands on his face, both of them, the way she had put her hands on his face when he was small, this ancient and fundamental gesture that has no translation into any other language. "Are you hurt?" she said. "Most of it isn't mine." "Nathan." "I'm all right." He paused, a pause that contained something it was taking him time to arrange. "It's finished. Vance is in federal custody. Pruitt has what he needs." He paused again. "They know where Clara is." Dorothy closed her eyes. She kept her hands on his face. "Her father," she said. "Pruitt went to him tonight." She nodded. Her eyes remained closed for a moment. When she opened them, they were wet, and she did not do anything about this because, at 78 years old and after 40 years of waiting, she had earned the right to let her eyes do what they were going to do. "Come inside," she said. "You look like you need coffee." He almost smiled. She saw at the beginning of it at the corner of his mouth, and it was the same smile, the one from the photograph, the one that had been 18 years old in June of 1984, in a parking lot in Phoenix, and that had been somewhere for 40 years, being whatever it had been, and was here now worn and incomplete, but recognizable, undeniably and irreducibly recognizable. "Is there apple pie?" he said. "Not here, but there will be." They went inside. Senator Hargrove Ellison had been 76 years old for 3 months and had the particular quality of a man who has outlasted the things that were supposed to break him, not through any special quality of endurance, but simply through the continuation of living, the way a tree survives a storm, not because it is stronger than the storm, but because it was already there when the storm arrived and is still there after it passes. He had known for 40 years that his daughter was dead. He had accepted this knowledge, or rather had done the thing that is usually described as accepting knowledge that cannot be changed, which is to build a life around the absence rather than inside it. He had served in the Senate for another 16 years after Clara disappeared. He had remarried in 1991, a quiet ceremony, a woman he had known since college who had lost her own first husband and understood the particular quality of loving someone after grief. He had grandchildren through his son from his first marriage, and he had put Clara's photographs in every room of every house he had ever lived in since 1984, not as shrines but as presences, as the ordinary acknowledgement that she had existed and continued to exist in the fabric of the family's life, regardless of what had been done to that existence. He had known she was dead. He had not known where. Pruitt had come to his house in Scottsdale at 11 that night and had sat in his living room and told him with the directness and the specific humanity of a man who had spent a long time preparing this conversation and had not found a way to make it painless, and had stopped trying to what had been found and what was known and what would happen in the days that followed. The senator had listened without interruption. He was very still. His hands, which had the tremor of a man in his mid-70s, were folded in his lap, and they did not tremble more than usual during this conversation, which was either a form of control or a form of shock, and it was not clear which. After Pruitt finished, the senator sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "The boy, Nathan Harlan." Pruitt said, "His name now is Cole Maddox. He's been living in Phoenix for 25 years. He's a veteran, Desert Storm." He paused. "He's the reason we have what we have tonight. Without him, Warren Vance's operation continues indefinitely." The senator nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. He looked at the photograph on the side table, Clara at 5 years old at the beach, squinting into the sun with the complete, unself-conscious happiness of a child who has not yet learned that happiness is something to be protected. "He tried to save her," the senator said. "He did. And they took 40 years from him for it." "Yes." The senator was quiet for another long moment. "I want to meet him," he said, "when it's appropriate, when the time is right." He paused. "I want to tell him that whatever they took from him in the name of protecting what was done to my daughter, it was not done on my behalf. It was not done in her name." His voice remained even the measured voice of a man who had spent 50 years in public life and had learned to hold the difficult things with a certain steadiness. She would not have wanted that. She was 7 years old, and I only had 7 years with her, but I knew her well enough to know that. Pruitt said that he would arrange it. The senator thanked him. When Pruitt left, the senator sat alone in his living room for a long time, with Clara's photograph on the table beside him, in the particular silence of a man receiving the last piece of a story that has been incomplete for 40 years, and discovering that completion and resolution are not the same thing, that an ending does not undo what preceded it, but that it does finally and at great cost allow the weight to be set down. He sat there until the desert sky outside his window began to lighten. Then he went to wake his wife. The excavation took 11 days. Pruitt's forensic team was meticulous in the way of people who understand that what they are doing will be looked at by other eyes and judged by standards that do not allow for haste or sloppiness. They worked from the northeast corner of the diner's foundation inward, and on the 4th day, they found what they were looking for, and on the 7th day, the identification was complete, and on the 11th day, the site was documented and released, and the work of understanding what had been found was passed to the people whose work it was to carry it forward. Senator Ellison was notified on the morning of the 7th day. Cole stood with him when Clara's remains were brought out. They stood side by side in the early morning light of a November day in the Arizona desert, the old senator and the man who was both Cole Maddox and Nathan Harlan, and neither of them spoke. And the silence between them was the silence of two people who understand that some things cannot be improved upon by language and should not be attempted. Afterward, the senator put his hand on Cole's arm. "Thank you," he said, "for bringing her back." Cole looked at him. At this man who had spent 40 years living with the same absence that Dorothy had spent 40 years refusing to accept, who had grieved and rebuilt, and continued in the way of a man who had decided that living was itself a form of honoring what was lost. "I'm sorry," Cole said, "for how long it took." "You lost 40 years too," the senator said. It was almost exactly what Pruitt had told him Ellison would say, which told Cole something about the specific quality of this man's particular kind of grace, that it was consistent, that it had not been produced for the occasion, but was simply the thing he carried. That accounting is not between us. We were both victims of the same wrong. He paused. "I'd like it if we could see each other again, not for any official purpose, just to know each other." Another pause. "She would have wanted to know you, the boy who tried." Cole did not say anything for a moment. His throat had done something that made speech temporarily inadvisable. "I would like that," he said. They shook hands. The senator's grip was firm. He walked back to his car, and Cole watched him go, and the morning light of November in Arizona came over the desert in the specific and unhurried way of light in open country, spreading across the ground, without preference, illuminating the ordinary and the sacred with the same quality of attention. The diner came down in February and went up again in April. It was not a rapid process, and it was not a simple one, and it was not in several significant moments a certain one, because building things is always partly an act of faith, and faith of the specific kind required to begin again in a place where something has been broken is not a resource that comes without cost. Dorothy was the one who decided what remained and what was rebuilt. The crew that Cole assembled, which was partly Boone and Griff and Dex and Harmon, working alongside actual contractors, and partly a collection of people from the surrounding area who had heard the story and wanted to contribute something to its continuation, brought the structures down and poured the new foundation and framed the walls and put on the roof. And through all of it, Dorothy moved with the purposeful quality she brought to everything, making decisions about what was kept and what was replaced with the clear-eyed practicality of someone who has decided what matters and has organized her life around it for long enough that the organization is now simply who she is. The counter was kept. It was reinforced and refinished and put back in the same position. And the first morning it was back in place, Dorothy ran her hand along the surface of it in the way of someone acknowledging something that has been away and is now returned. The clock was kept. The one that ran 5 minutes slow. It had survived the attack in the particular way of cheap and sturdy things sitting on a shelf above the kitchen door at an angle that had placed it outside the path of the damage. It went back on the wall in its original position. It was still 5 minutes slow. The photograph of Nathan at 18 was restored and reframed and went back on the wall above the pie case. Beside it on the same small shelf, the motorcycle trophy from the county fair. And below, both of them in a new frame, the piece of paper in Nathan's handwriting. "I'll be back for dinner, don't wait up." He had come back. It had taken longer than either of them had anticipated. But the sign above the door of the rebuilt Cross Junction diner said what it said, and what it said was true. Cross Junction, where the lost find their way back. Boone ran the front of the house. He had come to this through a process that he described when anyone asked as stumbling into it, which was not entirely accurate, but was the version that suited his self-presentation as a man who made decisions casually and without deliberation, which was not who Boone was at all, but which served as useful protective coloring. Griff and Dex were in the kitchen. Dex had turned out to have an aptitude for pastry that surprised everyone, including Dex, and Dorothy had, after 3 weeks of watching him produce increasingly creditable apple pies, declared that she was willing to take the early mornings off for the first time in 42 years. Harmon stood at the door most mornings. He had a quality of calm welcome that was unusual in a man of his particular dimensions in history, and travelers who stopped at Cross Junction often reported that the first thing they noticed about the place was the big man at the door who made them feel, before they had even come inside, that they were expected. Seamus arrived 6 weeks after the surgery in exactly the timeline he had specified to the nurse, walking with a slight forward lean that he was working on eliminating, and that the physical therapist in Flagstaff had told him would resolve with time and compliance with the exercise regimen. Seamus's compliance with the exercise regimen was partial, which was the most that anyone who knew him had expected. He sat at the counter his first morning back with a coffee, black and no sugar, and looked around the rebuilt dining room with the expression of a man conducting an inventory of the things that had been preserved and the things that had been replaced, and finding the ratio satisfactory. Dorothy set a piece of apple pie in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked up the fork. Extra cinnamon, he said. Always, she said. The Crossroads Brotherhood was not an organization that announced itself loudly. It did not have billboards. It did not have a marketing strategy or a social media presence or a nonprofit communications consultant. It had a mailing address, which was the Cross Junction Diner on Highway 40, and a phone number, which was the landline behind the counter, and a reputation which moved the way reputations move in communities where the distance between people is managed by trust rather than proximity. Veterans who needed help finding things they had lost found their way there. Families looking for people who had vanished found their way there. People who had run out of official channels and official answers and needed someone to try. The unofficial ones came and found Cole at the counter or in the garage behind the diner, working on something with an engine, and sat down with him and told him what they were looking for. And some of them went home with answers and some of them did not. But all of them went home having been heard, which was not nothing, which was in fact the beginning of something, even if the something took a long time to arrive. Cole ran it without ceremony and without the title of anything, because titles had never been a thing he placed particular value on, which was notable, given that he had spent 25 years being addressed by one. He ran it the way he ran everything, with the patient economy of a man who has learned that the most effective form of effort is the kind that does not waste itself on anything except the specific task in front of it. Danny Ellison arrived on a Thursday in October. He was 25 years old and drove a truck that had been better days and looked like someone who had spent the drive from Scottsdale organizing what he intended to say and was not entirely satisfied with any of the versions he had produced. He came through the door and looked around the dining room with the slightly uncertain quality of someone who has arrived at a place they have been intending to arrive at for a long time and is now navigating the gap between the intention and the reality. Harmon pointed him to the counter. Cole was there. He looked up when Danny sat down. Danny had the senator's eyes, dark and direct and carrying the same quality of attention that characterized his grandfather, the ability to look at a thing directly and stay looking until he understood it. My grandfather passed last month, Danny said. He said it simply without the performance of grief, but also without the performance of its absence. Before he died, he told me to find you. He said you gave our family permission to rest. He paused. He said that to me 3 times in the last week, like he wanted to make sure I had it. Cole looked at him. He was a good man, Cole said. I'm sorry for your loss. Danny nodded. He looked at the counter for a moment, then back up. That's not the only reason I came. He paused. I grew up knowing about Clara, knowing about what happened to her. It was there the whole time I was growing up, this absence that shaped everything, that shaped my grandfather and shaped the family and shaped the way all of us understood what it meant to lose someone and not know where they were. He looked at Cole steadily. You found her. You gave us back an ending that we could put to rest. I want to do that for other families. I want to learn how. Cole did not answer immediately. He looked at this young man with his grandfather's eyes and the particular directness of someone who has organized their intention clearly enough that they are not asking permission so much as announcing a decision they have already made. Dorothy from the kitchen doorway was watching. Cole looked at her. She gave him the specific look that she had been giving him for 6 months, the look that said she had an opinion and that her opinion was that he already knew what the right answer was and should stop treating it as uncertain. He looked back at Danny. It's not clean work, Cole said. You find people sometimes and sometimes you don't. You get families their answers sometimes, and sometimes the answer is the one they were afraid of. It stays with you. The ones you don't find stay with you. I know, Danny said. I want to try anyway. Cole held his gaze for a moment. Sit down, he said. Coffee first. 2 years later, in a garage behind the Cross Junction Diner on a Sunday morning, when the desert had its October quality of light and the air was cold enough to show your breath, and the highway was quiet in the particular way of early mornings, before the day's traffic had decided what it intended to do, Cole stood beside the 1984 Harley-Davidson Sportster and ran his hand along the tank. He had restored it over the course of 8 months. He had not rushed the process because it was not a process that should be rushed, and also because there was something about the particular work of restoring this specific machine that he had understood from the first moment he lifted the canvas cover in the old garage required a quality of attention that was different from ordinary mechanical work. This was the work of recovering something, of returning something to what it had been, while accepting that what it had been and what it was now were not separable things, that the 40 years were part of it, that the restoration was not the erasure of time, but the integration of it. The tank was cherry red. The chrome was done. The engine turned over with the sound of something that had been away for a long time and had come back ready. Dorothy came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the old wooden chair that she kept in the garage for this purpose and had been keeping there since he started the work. They sat together in the cold morning air of October and drank the coffee. After a while, Dorothy said, "Do you remember the summer before you went away, that last summer?" Cole thought. The memories came differently than they had 2 years ago. Less like shapes behind frosted glass and more like photographs. Edges clear light, correct the specific reality of things as they had actually been. They were not all there. There were still absences, still walls in certain corridors of the past that had been sealed for too long to be opened in a single lifetime. But enough had come back. Enough to know who he had been before, and enough to understand the shape of the distance between then and now. "Some of it," he said, "more every year. You used to come out here in the mornings," she said, "before your father was up. You'd sit on the bike and you wouldn't start it. Just sit on it." She looked at the Sportster. "I'd watch you from the kitchen window. You'd sit there for 20 minutes sometimes just thinking. What did you think I was thinking about?" She considered this. Everything. The way you think when you're 18 and the world is still the size of a highway and every direction is possible. Cole looked at the bike, at the cherry red tank and the chrome and the engine that had been rebuilt with the patience that some things require. "I'm going to ride it," he said. Dorothy looked at him. "To Flagstaff first," he said. "See Seamus. He keeps telling me he wants to see it finished." He paused. "Then east, maybe as far as the road goes." He paused again. "I'm not running. I know where I'm going, and I know I'm coming back. But I want to—" He stopped, tried again. "I told you once I was going to ride across the whole country." "You told me when you were 12, she said, from that window. "I want to do it, not to go away, just to do the thing I said I was going to do." He looked at the bike and then at her. "Is that all right?" Dorothy looked at her son for a long moment. "There's a condition," she said, and her voice had something in it that was almost, not quite, but almost the precise echo of the voice he had used with her 2 years ago in this same conversation's inverse, when he had said those same words about her going north to Flagstaff and she had accepted them, and the echo of it was something both of them heard and neither of them named. "Sunday dinners," she said. "Every week. You come back by Sunday dinner, or you call me on the landline and tell me why you can't." She paused. Non-negotiable. Cole looked at her. He did not say anything. He set down his coffee cup and leaned over and kissed the top of her head, and Dorothy Harlan sat very still in her wooden chair and received this with the dignity of a woman who had waited 40 years for it and had always known it was coming. Inside the diner, Boone was calling from somewhere near the counter. "Cole, Danny's got 3 files. He wants your read on all of them before noon." Cole straightened up. He looked at the Sportster one more time, at the cherry red and the chrome and the engine that was ready. He picked up his coffee. "I'm coming," he called. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at Dorothy still in her chair, her coffee in both hands, the cold morning light of October falling across her face, the way it had fallen across her face for 42 years of mornings in this desert. And she looked back at him with the expression she had not let herself wear for 40 years, the expression of a woman who has what she was waiting for. "Sunday," she said. "Sunday," he said. He went inside. The door closed behind him, and the sign above it turned in the morning wind. This piece of painted wood that had been her declaration and her invitation, and her refusal to accept what the world had told her, was finished, and the letters of it moved in and out of the light. Cross Junction, where the lost find their way back. The Harley Sportster sat in the open garage door with the October light on it, cherry red and chrome patient as the desert, ready as a thing that has been a very long time away and is finally completely and without reservation home. Outside on Highway 40, the first trucks of the morning were beginning to run. The day was starting. Dorothy finished her coffee. She stood up and she went inside to open the diner, and the neon sign in the window came on red and gold, and blinking its particular rhythm, the O doing what it had done for 20 years, and the light of it fell across the standing water in the parking lot and made something briefly bright, and then was just the ordinary light of an open sign on a highway diner at the beginning of another day. Open. The coffee was on, the pie was in the oven, and the door was as it had always been, unlocked.